Chapter 28. Accelerate thrust. Flank speed. 20% downward at 21.73. Grand Admiral Tethys shouted her orders to her helm, not bothering with the shipboard comm after watching the Temple Garden fail to capitalize on the opportunity to incapacitate the Executor's hangar operations. She did not hesitate to take advantage of the opening. All forward batteries fire at will. She turned her head from her real-time perspective of the ship's position through the forward viewport to hail the TACnet her techs had enabled, linking the Fifth Fleet with her own contingent. Shisa, Barden, take up positions on our rear, match for speed, but only decrease downward angle 10 degrees. We will not give him an exit. Tethys felt the tingling vibrations of victory race up her arms as the inherited chaos began to situate into the order she was engineering. "Ma'am, that will line them up with this forward torpedo arrays," Captain Denton Arno advised, the faint wrinkles adorning his brow pulling tight with anticipation. Tethys raised her head to convey the message to the captains again, but paused. "Agreed, Arno, but our wayward captain out there isn't going to risk suicide with the balance of his fleet so far out of range." "But they are closing quickly, ma'am," the man offered quickly in return. Tethys spun to the holotable as she felt the first slight vibrations from the forward turbolaser batteries. Padding quickly to the image, she placed her hands around the curved lip of the table and launched into her visual assessment. She knew the opponent well as she studied the tight grouping of red blips as the separate fleets began to converge upon themselves 500,000 kilometers distant. "Shala," she said to herself, "what are you attempting?" "Ma'am, is that Reese out there with her?" Arnau was at her heels, his attention drawn to the Executor-class Star Destroyer, crossing paths with the old Venator Shala commanded. "Most likely," she said without turning, her attention toward her second-in-command, "which means Selak is responsible for all this chaos." "If that is true, ma'am, we need to be wary of Reese's fighter wings," Arnau responded with a subtle mumbling. Tethys half turned to the younger man in her charge. "We need to be wary of all four elements, Denton. They have everyone positioned in line with their strengths, in ways they may not even be aware of." The sound of quizzical thought, an expressed harumph that escaped Arnau's lips, caused Tethys to turn to him entirely. "You have already forgotten Vomen planetside, have you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in disappointment. Denton's dark pigmentation glowing with a trace of red at the mention of Vomen, for whom he had not accounted. "Captain, they can wage orbital battle with lethal acuity, which must be adjusted for." Tethys breathed a heavy sigh as she turned back toward the hollow image, watching patiently as the blue pattern of live events refreshed. She narrowed her eyes again as she focused on the contingent of blockade vessels, noting the divide forming between the screening Star Destroyers immediately behind her position. The image waved through another refresh cycle as 3 additional squares materialized within the image. The 3 destroyers she had assigned flanking maneuvers. She again raised her head to address the TACnet. "Gunderson, target is sublight array only. I don't want you wasting time trying to penetrate the energy shielding on their hyperdrive." "Copy, ma'am," a rough voice returned to her earbead, and distortion coupled with the electronic modulation caused the words to take on a menacing tone. "Grand Admiral, you need to hear this," a comms technician voiced in her earbead. Tethys turned her attention to the communications console array toward the rear of the command deck. She shook her head slightly as she nodded toward the energetic young woman. "Sir, our shields are 60% and declining rapidly. Drex and Notley can only hold off incoming phalanx for a time. May I suggest you give the Grand Admiral an opening to continue fire while we correct and account for the converging fleets outward?" "And allow these miscreants to dictate our actions fully? Have you lost the nerve to take the fight to the enemy now?" "Sir, I only suggest we present this vessel as an option for Lord Vader to return to." "And now prognosticating our demise, have we a fleet, Captain?" "A fleet that is currently en route to account for the multiple threats you have ignored since the outset of this campaign." "How dare you, Captain? This is grounds for court-martial." Tethys felt the pangs of rage Piett must have been suppressing as her own flared fully. pumping adrenaline through her body and wanting nothing more than the opportunity to choke the life from the daft Admiral. "Give me a line on that, Ensign. I want the entirety of Executor to hear this." With several finger taps over illuminated keys before her and a toggle of a switch, the ensign turned to her Grand Admiral with a thumbs up. "On that, I can certainly agree. For the time being, Admiral, you are relieved of duty. Captain, the ship is yours." She finished, motioning to the comms technician to end the outbound feed, shaking her head feverishly as she turned back toward the holo display, wondering what it would take to arrest this Captain Piett from Lord Vader's command and give him charge over her own fleet. To her surprise, the emerging squares that had been present within the holo image were not present after the image refreshed its real-time view. "That's odd," she thought to herself. "Ma'am!" one of Tethys' technicians shouted from his analysis pit close by. "Speak!" she shouted back without turning, staring blankly into the image, watching as the colors bled into themselves, the specific geometries of friend and foe warping into an abstract illusion of presence. "Temple Garden has ceased firing." She lifted her head and turned slowly to the technician, her mind wandering down separate paths of possibility. Tethys looked past the technician and squinted her eyes to look upon the massive vessel through the forward viewport. The numerous turbo-laser blasts from Executor and Relentless littering the shielding surrounding the Mon Calamari liner. The creases that had formed in the corners of her eyes pulled tight as they began to open wide, her mouth following suit as comprehension began taking form. The voices of various crew members, as well as her own captain, questioning what she was seeing, faded in her ears as she saw the blast slam into the shielding surrounding Temple Garden, without the residual disbursement of energy coursing perpendicular to the blast trajectory in waves of diminishing threat. The blasts were absorbed in tight concentric circles, surrounding the impact trajectory and funneled into the ship's hull through large circular appendages. She whipped her head back to the analysis pit, one-eyed forward to the viewport. "Is that vessel large enough to incorporate an oscillating device?" "Running the numbers, ma'am," the same technician responded immediately. The change within Admiral Tethys was palpable as the earlier tingle of premature excitement began to erode from the finely sharpened blade of underestimation. She raised a hand to her forehead and started vigorously rubbing at her temple flesh, realizing she had just possibly made the same mistake her captain had. "Shala, we're losing shields faster than we're making progress with our laser batteries. The armor on Executor is only magnified by the strength of its shielding. They are beginning to target our sublight capability, so it's now or never," Nox said through the device attached to her Montral. Shala felt the urge to yell out her frustration, but knew the continuity of forward operations depended on her ability to maintain her discipline. "Copy, Nox. Give me one more minute, and we will be within range," she responded with a finger pressed to her throat, the fingernail threatening to draw blood in the process as she spun to the left bank of data pits, contained within the port tower bridge of the old lady. "We need more speed, people," she told a group of mixed species crew that occupied each data station, monitoring screen, and control console. "We have approximately 30 seconds to get ourselves within torpedo range of Executor." She returned her finger to her throat. "Reese, how much more time do you need to launch your wings?" "Shala, you realize we're committed fully once we do," he responded with a slight hesitation, her mind understanding his meaning implicitly. "I do, Reese. We cannot hold off in preparation for what might materialize. Voman's success will be determined by our ability to restrict his opponent's reinforcement attempts and understand that threat come from any Star Destroyer out here." "I do, Shala. Give me another 30 seconds, Reese responded, her right Montreal returning his reply as her left conveyed the shout from her forward data pit. "Ma'am, we're in range," the senior member of the tactical station alerted his captain. "Now or never indeed, Nox," she whispered. "All forward torpedo banks, fire!" she shouted, suppressing the fury coursing through her veins. She would have gladly traded places with Nox for the mission had Voman not suggested the unusual tactic of placing the least aggressive commander in charge of the floating chaos that Temple Garden represented. But she did have to admit to herself that nothing this group did was either customary or field-tested, and that fact would be incredibly annoying to defend. "Nock, prepare your oscillators and engage your energy shield. We're coming in hot," she said as she turned and walked with conviction toward the viewport. She placed a hand astride a vertical beam and laid into the clear transparisteel. She narrowed her eyes toward the 8 streaks of blue carrying their ordnance toward the Imperial behemoth. A slight lurch in her vessel, causing her to brace herself with that same hand as another volley of 8 blue streaks following the same course through the diminishing distance between the old lady and Executor made the same deadly promise of continuing annoyance. She knew the torpedoes would cause minimal, if any, damage, but that wasn't the point. "Take the bait, Ozzel," she thought as tiny black specks began to take shape between herself and the brilliant swirls of oranges, yellows, and lazy streaks of red that Ambria boasted to the galaxy. "Prove me right, you Tongnaki," she said to anyone listening as she continued staring out after the linear streaks of propellant gases, following them with narrowing eyes in the hopes of catching the impossible signs of impact. Shala turned back toward the hollow image, her eyes training on the upper left corner of the orbital representation. Where are you? She had expected the emergence of the 3 Star Destroyers, which had gone dark toward the beginning of the encounter some time ago, but had yet to show up. "Pierce, why am I not seeing those dark SDs? Did we miss something?" "No, Cap, we didn't," a frail and aged voice responded. Her choice for comm specialist, the man was 3 times her age, blind, and occasionally dove into tirades and rants in efforts to close arguments from 50 years prior, but was the most gifted signal and transponder analyst any of them had ever worked with. "Cap, I do have a scrambled signal coming in I cannot decipher." "Play over comms, Piers," Shala responded as she continued studying the hollow image. A warbling, static-laced feed echoed through the entirety of the command deck that changed in amplitude and effect as the older man continued spiraling knobs with a withered hand placed against an earmuff plastered to his head. The sounds mingled before melding into a trio of trading whispers, overlapping into incoherent garble. "Cap, I am working on it. This is the first time I've ever encountered audio encryption," Piers said with an almost youthful exuberance. "It's a matter of isolation as the signal is RF." Shala turned fully to the man some 20 meters away and began walking toward him. She could see him working furiously on the various dials and switches, an effort to combine the coded terminus for the aged comms method. RF? "I would wager it's either Alliance or Rebel in origin, Cap," Piers added. "Why?" she asked. "Because Imperials wouldn't use it, nor would they be monitoring it." Shala couldn't argue the assessment as the audio throughout her bridge echoed eerie whispers. She did not recognize the pattern that Piers clearly did as the audio began to slow down in synchronicity. He then isolated 3 separate signals within the original and played them individually. A gleeful chirp came from the man as he spun his gaze toward his approaching captain. "Ma'am," he began before she cut him off. "Captain, Piers. Captain." "Yeah, okay. It is the same message, Shala," he said excitedly. Shala rolled her eyes slightly as she waited patiently for man to get to a point. "Listen," he said, trimming off the secondary and tertiary repetitions. A garbled gibberish in a language nobody could understand echoed through the command deck, everyone halting their activities as all eyes turned to their captain and comm specialist. "What language is that?" Shala asked as the older man halted the relay, letting the dying echoes of the strange message fall away. She half expected a quizzical look in response as he lifted his head to face her completely, shocking her with a crazed smile stretching across his withered features, his glazed, milky eyes consuming her entirely. "The same we are speaking now, Shala, just not in a way we would expect." "Piers," she began. "Listen, Cap," he said as his hand found a large silver dial. He punched its center and turned it slightly counterclockwise. "Watch the threat on your 6. Decant from hyperspace imminent. Scramble your fleets. Flank speed convergence on Executor." A squelched, high-pitched whine emanated from the earbeat astride her right mantra. "What?" she said a little too loudly. Shala, receiving a highly encrypted message, but the source is unknown. I know, Reese, we've already worked through it, she said before relaying the contents of Pierre's work. We haven't gotten that far, he responded with a hint of melancholy. Send it over, she replied, tapping Piers on the shoulder. I have another for you, Piers. That's old man to you, young lady, Piers said, his withered smile stretching further across his cheeks as he plastered his hand over his ear again and began working the dials before him. He isolated the original message to the same process and played it over the old lady's feed to their shared technet. Launch your fighter contingent, scramble the fleet, and converge on Executor. Get that, Reese? Shala asked, her finger pinching at her throat again. I did too, Nock returned. Old man, I need to know how confident you are in your assessment, Shala said quietly to the comm specialist. If you're asking whether I believe this is Imperial, it isn't. Reese, launch your fighter's contingent. Now. All vessels converge on Executor flank speed. Now or never, Nock. Engage, she shouted, letting her pent-up frustration loose with the verbal volley, knowing full well she had just issued what may just be her final order. Sir, has he already forgotten about the advancing threat? A junior signal analyst said in a whisper. His youthful voice wavered, betraying his attempts to steady himself. My sentiments exactly, Captain Piett thought to himself as he watched the technician's screen adjust for both the increasing speed and vectors of the advancing fleet, thrown askew by the crooked starboard cant the Executor was enacting. Ozzel, you fool, he almost said aloud, gripping the rail to the console bank's left as he eyed his admiral. Sir, I would suggest discretion in committing so fully to a single target. For the sake of one, you're exposing our hangar decks to incoming torpedo fire, he finally said, unwilling to say nothing in the face of the tactical blunder. When I want your opinion, Captain, I will ask for it, Admiral Ozzel returned with a snark, his jowls slack as he looked down the bridge of his nose at his captain in the crew pit below him. Sir, I only maintain that General Veers is still waiting on the bulk of reinforcement for his unit's planetside, Piett responded with growing frustration, suppressing the sudden urge to unholster his firearm. Tethys has graciously committed her ground forces toward that endeavor, Captain. Piett could feel his heart hammering in his chest. Only because you put us in this position, he thought. Admiral, at least commit several of the screening Star Destroyers to protect our hangar decks. Your executed position has left us exposed. He was running out of patience for diplomacy. Ozzel turned slowly to stare out the forward viewport, watching as the Mon Calamari behemoth rolled slowly, firing from every turbo laser emplacement the ship had to offer as it lined up with the Imperial dreadnought, peppering the entire upper deck of the Executor with unending bolts of red and blue energy. Excellent, Captain, he said, returning his attention toward the ship's captain. As you see fit. Although not necessarily a victory in Piett's eyes, at least it was an admission of the Admiral's zealousness. He tapped at his throat. Defiance, Corvair, Severance converged to intercept incoming fire from the outbound fleet. Screen our tow midships. We must service our forces groundside, Piett said with his crisp, clean accent, providing no excuse nor rebuttal for or from the assigned ship's captains. He ascended the short steps out of the analysis pit and turned his attention forward through the viewport, watching as the battle silently played out before him. Converging hyphens of energy trading places with one another, neither ship causing any sustainable damage to the other for the moment. He understood what the Admiral was trying to accomplish, but also understood the insanity they attempt to find. Turning into the makeshift warship with all topside turbolaser batteries firing away was a mistake he wasn't sure he could rectify in time. He squinted his eyes as he slowly approached the Admiral's side before the thick transparisteel. Sir, our shields are 60% and declining rapidly. Drex and Notley can only hold off incoming phalanx for a time. May I suggest you give the Grand Admiral an opening to continue fire while we correct and account for the converging fleets outward? Admiral Ozzel wheeled around to look upon his captain fully. And allow these miscreants to dictate our actions fully? Have you lost the nerve to take the fight to the enemy now? He recited, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth as his beady eyes seemed to disappear further into his skull. Sir, I only suggest we present this vessel as an option for Lord Vader to return to. Piett found the words despite his building frustration. Ozzel cut him off, and now prognosticating our demise. Have we a fleet, Captain? Piett felt the internal tether release, the suppression of his aggravation give way to contemptible rage. A fleet that is currently en route to account for the multiple threats you have ignored since the outset of this campaign. How dare you, Captain? Ozzel began, his face reddening at a feverish pace. This is grounds for court-martial. On that, I can certainly agree, Grand Admiral Tethys said over the entirety of the shipboard comm. For the time being, Admiral, you are relieved of duty. Captain, the ship is yours. She finished, the twang of electronic static doing nothing to conceal her adamant tone. Ozzel could say nothing as his mustache furrowed from the contortions his face involuntarily conveyed. The flushing anger that had previously reddened his face gained a burning quality that he could feel on the ridges of his ears. But he knew he could say nothing. He could only investigate the blank, deceptively vacant expression of his Captain Piett and blow out his fueled rage and exasperated, wordless breath before turning to remove himself from the command deck. He knew any further action on his part could very well lead him to this court-martial in the eyes of the Grand Admiral. Well played, Tethys, well played, he thought to himself, averting the gaze of every officer and enlisted conscript by staring at his own feet as he shuffled them toward the turbolift banks. The walk seemed to take forever as he was left to silent contemplation and chaotic thoughts that weren't cohesive by any stretch. He reached the lift and entered as the door slid open. Without turning to face his crew, he disappeared from their view with a quiet hiss of the door actuators. Piett stared after the man for a few more seconds before returning his view forward, the contest of laser fire continuing despite the tumult he had been engaged in. Within the blink of his eyes, the enemy vessel stopped firing. Piett canted his head to the side and watched through narrowing eyes as turbo laser fire from the Executor bombarded the Mon Calamari ship from stem to stern. He glanced down to his right through the viewport to see Relentless enacting the same scene from her position below them. Returning to the heavily modified warship, he watched as circular protrusions emerged from several ports along the entire axis of the ship's hull. The pit of his stomach fell from its position as he wheeled around suddenly. "Cease fire! 30-degree shift port!" "Sir?" Not entirely sure who had questioned him, he rushed to his helmsman and coolly repeated the order. "We need distance between us and that ship now." He had seen emerging technologies within discretionary intelligence briefings and knew what oscillator collectors looked like. "That," he said to himself as he tapped his throat. Mayhew, secure hangar operations and brace for impact. All hands secure your positions." Piett swung his gaze forward again, watching as the Mon Cal liner consumed the continuing turbolaser fire from Relentless for a split second before the green hyphens began finding purchase on the ship's hull plating. Vacuous explosions tore through the meek durasteel, fragmented explosions that sucked themselves out of existence as quickly as they flared to life. Before he could comprehend the damage the ship must be sustaining, he was blinded by a bright bling flash that consumed the entirety of the transparasteel, causing everyone looking forward to shield their eyes as they turned from the brilliance with squawks of discomfort, surprise, and shock. Piett felt ripples pass under his feet, tremors that vibrated through the skeletal superstructure of the Executor with rhythmic consequence. Several console banks sparked and flashed as their electrical connections were severed. He could hear the clanking of metal on metal as parts broke free and fell from their places of origin. Despite his growing curiosity, he knew this was only the beginning, and he refrained from moving from his position as he held onto the upper thrust bar atop the helm's control console. On cue, a seismic burst flared through the ship, shattering control screens and causing most personnel to clamp hands tightly over their ears. He felt something warm and wet drip into his neck and risked breaking a hand free from the death grip he had enacted on the thrust bar to streak a finger over his ear. Droplets of blood adorned his fingertips as he smeared the thin trickle of free-flowing liquid across his cheek. Piett looked up and into the eyes of the helmsman directly in front of him, small trails of blood tracing their way down his cheeks. The man's eyes suddenly closed tight to the shared pains they were all suffering. Piett looked down to see the man clinging tightly to the helm control yokes. Both hands continued to carry out and maintain his ship's orders, his captain's orders, despite his obvious pain and agony. Piett could only hear a sharp ringing as he slowly spun his head toward the viewport. The ship that had consumed the transparisteel was gone, leaving him with a clear view of the planet below.